Hi students, welcome to psychology and welcome to this video which is going to take you through a short topic on research methods in psychology. Now if I can just ask you to make sure that you've got some paper to hand and some stationery, because there's lots of little tasks along the way and quite a few notes that you are going to be asked to make to help you understand this video. So, what do we mean by research methods in psychology? Well, by now you should know that psychology is classically defined as the scientific study of people's behaviour and the mind. So, to be able to understand people's behaviour, psychologists actually have to go out there and study people and carry out research on people. Now, there are lots of different ways in which psychologists can study people's behaviour. They could carry out interviews and talk to them and ask them questions about what they're thinking, they're feeling, to get an insight into their behaviour. Or they could study lots of people at the same time by sending out questionnaires to ask questions about their attitudes, their feelings, their behaviours. Or psychologists might actually observe and watch people in different settings to get an understanding about their behaviour. But the most favoured way in which psychologists study people's behaviour is to carry out experiments. Now, psychology is classed as a scientific subject, and psychologists prefer experiments because experiments are a scientific way of conducting research, and you'll understand this from studying your sciences at school. Now, in psychology, you're going to be learning about different types of experiments: lab experiments, field experiments, and natural quasi-experiments. Now, this video is not going to take you through all of those. It's going to concentrate just on lab experiments. Right then, your first task really is to get yourself a piece of paper, and I'd like you to sketch out a table which looks something like this. Because what I'm going to ask you to do is to produce a glossary of key terms which are related to lab experiments. So on one side you're going to write down what the key term is, and then we're going to add a definition. So there's lots of new terms, lots of new language associated with psychology, and as a psychology student you're expected to be able to use all those terms confidently and use them accurately by understanding what they mean. So pause the video if you need to and spend some time just sketching out a little glossary table. And when you're ready, just restart the video. So, exactly what is a lab experiment? Now, we're going to look at these key features in a lot more detail throughout the video. But essentially, as a starting point, a lab experiment takes place in what we describe as a controlled or artificial setting. Every experiment has at least two conditions to it, and psychologists are looking to see if there is any difference in behaviour across those two conditions. In experiments, the researcher will also be manipulating something and measuring something. And all experiments, lab experiments especially, are standardised. So, let's have a look at an example of a lab experiment. Now, I've got a question in my head, and that question is, do energy drinks give people a better memory? Now, I like energy drinks. I drink them quite often, and I've been wondering whether drinking them actually would give people a better memory. So, a psychologist might decide to answer that question by carrying out a lab experiment. So, that experiment needs to start with a hypothesis. So the psychologist will make a very specific prediction about what they expect to happen when they carry out their experiment. And that prediction is what they are going to test by doing the experiment. So in this example, my hypothesis might be that people who drink 3 cans of Red Bull will remember more names of capital cities than people who drink water. So I'm making a very precise prediction, what I expect to happen when I carry out my experiment. And that prediction is going to be tested now by doing the experiment. So what's that experiment going to involve? Well, as I mentioned earlier, each experiment will have at least 2 conditions. So to test out this hypothesis, I need to have one condition, which is called the experimental condition. And that's going to involve a group of participants drinking Red Bull. And then there's going to be a second condition, and that's called the control condition. And that group of people are going to drink water. So I've got 2 groups or 2 conditions. Now, in every experiment, there is something that is being manipulated. Now, what's manipulated is called the independent variable, or we can just refer to it as the IV. So in this experiment, the IV, the independent variable, is the drink that participants are going to have. And the way I'm manipulating that is by giving one group of participants Red Bull to drink and the second group of participants water to drink. So here I have my 2 conditions, the Red Bull condition and the control condition. So once my participants have had their drinks, what I'm going to do is give them a list of capital cities to learn, and then I'm going to test them on how many of those they remember a little bit later. So every experiment will have something that is being measured, and that thing that is being measured is called the dependent variable, or the DV to abbreviate. So what I'm measuring in my experiment is a person's memory, and specifically I'm measuring that by counting the number of capital cities that participants will remember after I've tested them. So that's what the dependent variable is, what's being measured. Now, I also mentioned earlier that lab experiments are conducted in a very controlled and artificial setting. So what that means is that the experimenter, the researcher, is creating a situation. And that situation is an artificial one. And what participants are being asked to do is quite artificial. You wouldn't normally drink Red Bull and then drink some water, learn some capital cities and then be tested. That's not something that you do in everyday life. So that's why the situation is an artificial one. But it's very tightly controlled. And it's controlled in the way that one group of participants will get Red Bull to drink and the other group will get water to drink. Also, lab experiments are standardised. What that means is that everybody that takes part in that experiment will experience the same procedures and have the same experience. So, for example, all of the participants will have exactly the same list of capital cities to remember. They will all be tested after the same period of time. The only thing that will differ is the independent variable, the drink that they have. So hopefully all that makes sense to you. So we've got a little bit of a task now just to do a little bit of checking. So what we have here is 5 questions, 5 examples, and your task is simply to see if you can work out in each of these examples which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable. So if you need to pause the video, take a careful look through them, and on a piece of paper for each one of them write down what the independent and the dependent variable is. And at the end of this video you'll be able to check your answers to that. So when you're ready, restart the video and we'll move on to the next slide. So going back to my experiment, let's think about what the results might have been. So let's imagine that those participants in the experimental condition, the ones that drank the Red Bull, after I tested them, did remember more capital cities than those who drank the water. So that is exactly what I predicted in my hypothesis that would happen, and that's what the results show. So I can assume that's what is responsible for that result is the fact that participants drank Red Bull. So Red Bull does improve a person's memory. However, let's not get too excited. Is drinking Red Bull definitely responsible for remembering more capital cities? Does it definitely improve memory? Or could that be down to something else? So, what a researcher has to consider is that there could be other things, other variables that are affecting the DV, that are affecting, in this case, the number of capital cities that people remember. Now, those other variables we refer to as extraneous variables, and essentially they're a nuisance. We don't really want to have them having any impact on the DV. So what I'd like you to do is to think about our experiments, and I want you to see if you can come up with a list of possible extraneous variables, other things that could affect the dependent variable, a person's memory, specifically the number of capital cities that they remember. So again, you might want to pause the video now while you jot down some examples. And when you're ready, just restart it. So these are the extraneous variables that I thought about. So possibly it might be the impact of other foods or other drinks that people had. So maybe if you drank lots of coffee as well as the Red Bull, that coffee could have had an impact on the number of cities that you remembered. How tired or how alert a participant is could also affect their memory. Maybe how intelligent participants are. So if you're a really bright individual with a really good memory, then maybe you would have remembered lots of capital cities regardless if you drank the Red Bull or not. Maybe the testing conditions, the room that you were tested in, how hot or cold it was, could have an impact on how well you did. Also, something to think about is the actual list of capital cities. If they're capital cities that you've visited before, that you've read about, that you're familiar with, then they may stand out in your memory a little bit more, and that's why you remembered more of them. So essentially there are lots of other factors, other extraneous variables that could have an impact on how many capital cities somebody remembers, the dependent variable. And a researcher would have to anticipate some of those and actually do something about them. They'd have to control them or minimise their effect or get rid of them altogether. Because at the end of the day, with a lab experiment, researchers want to be able to make what's known as cause and effect statements. And essentially, what that means is to be able to conclude that the cause of people's improved memory, which is the effect, is actually drinking the Red Bull. And that's essentially what a lab experiment aims to achieve. To be able to say that the cause, what I manipulated, is responsible for the effect, the dependent variable. So, let's just summarise what we've learned about lab experiments at this point. So, another task for you, and that's to draw out a nice summary table of lab experiments which we're going to complete. So again, it might be worth pausing the video in a moment to give yourself time to do that. So if you model your summary table on what's on the video, then we're going to have space at the top to jot down what the key features are, and then towards the bottom of your summary table, we'll be looking at what the strengths and weaknesses are of lab experiments, and I'll explain what we mean by that in a moment. So when you're ready, restart the video and we'll start filling in that summary table. So, to recap, what have we learned? Well, lab experiments take place in a very controlled and artificial setting, and that has been created, that setting and that task, by the researcher. A lab experiment also involves two conditions, and we are looking to see if there is a difference in a particular behaviour between those two conditions. In this case, was there a difference in a person's memory across the two conditions? Also, an experiment involves an independent variable which is manipulated by the researcher, and also a dependent variable which will be measured by the researcher. And in lab experiments, extraneous variables need to be minimised, removed or controlled so they don't have an effect on the dependent variable. And all procedures, all instructions for each participant are standardised, so they all experience the same. Right then, let's take a moment to think about the strengths and weaknesses of lab experiments. So this is what we know as evaluation. So I've already stated that lab experiments are the preferred way of studying individuals' behaviour because they are very scientific. So there are lots of good points associated with carrying out lab experiments. However, they're not perfect and they do have their weaknesses or their problems. So what we have on this slide here are two strengths and two weaknesses of lab experiments. Now, it's a good idea, as well as your summary table of lab experiments, to have your glossary that you are building up as well. Because again, there are going to be lots of new terms here that you're going to need to understand the meaning of, such as demand characteristics, ecological validity, reliability. So you'll need to take those two tables and pause the video and spend a little bit of time reading through these, deciding which the strengths are and which the weaknesses are, adding them to your summary table, and also adding terms to the glossary. And when you're done, restart the video again. So, we're now moving on to the second part of our work on research methods, which concerns something called ethics. Now, psychologists are in a really lucky position in that they actually get to study people and what people do, their behaviour, what people think. Now, what that means is that we have to really look after the people that we study. We must protect our participants, treat them with respect and with dignity, and not subject them to anything that might harm them in any way. And that's what ethics is concerned with. So psychologists have to follow almost a set of rules which are called ethical guidelines to ensure that they do protect their participants at all points during the research process. So, you're going to need your glossary of key terms again, and we are going to be adding some key terms which are associated with ethics. So you can see that they are informed consent, the right to withdraw, deception, protection of participants, and privacy, confidentiality. So the next 2 slides will give you some reading material on these ethical terms, these ethical guidelines. So you need to work through the next 2 slides at your own pace, pause the video as you need to, and add some definitions and some explanations as to what these terms actually mean. So I'm going to move through the next 2 slides pretty quickly, and you just pause them as you need to. Okay, we now have a task which is centred around ethics. And this task is going to involve you watching a short video which is based on an experiment by Latané and Darley done in the 1960s. Now, essentially this experiment involves a naive participant. So a participant that's got no idea what this experiment is about and what's going on. And they're sitting in a waiting room. And while they're sitting in that waiting room, they see lots of smoke coming under the door into the room. Now, in one condition, that participant is on their own. In a second condition, they are sat in the room with a group of confederates. Now, a confederate is somebody who is playing a role in the experiment, and they're in on it essentially. Now, those confederates in the second condition have been told when they see the smoke coming through the door to do nothing, okay, to sit there and just carry on doing what they are doing. Now, Latané and Darley were interested in investigating emergency situations and how people behave in emergency situations. So, what you are going to need to do is do another YouTube search, and you are going to search for the smoke-filled room study. And it should be the first video that you find, and it lasts less than 3 minutes. So when you are ready, find that video on YouTube, pause this one and watch the smoke-filled room study. And then come back to this video because there's a little task for you about ethics. So, having watched the video, your task is to think about what the ethical issues are in this study. So, bearing in mind things like right to withdraw, informed consent, deception, which of those ethical issues do you think apply to this study? So write a short paragraph referring to your previous notes on these ethical issues and relate them to that video and that study by Latané and Darley. Right then, we've pretty much now come to the end of this lesson on research methods, on lab experiments. So this final slide just reveals the answers to your independent and dependent variable task from earlier on. So get your answers out, have a read through them, and give yourself some ticks, hopefully full marks, for identifying all the independent and dependent variables. So just to wrap up, what we expect that you have done during this lesson on research methods is to produce a glossary of key terms, to also have a nice summary table about lab experiments, the key features of lab experiments, the strengths and weaknesses, and also a short paragraph about the ethics of the smoke-filled room study. So thank you very much for listening. Keep all those notes safe, because we will be checking them when you join us in September, and there will be some testing of those as well. Thank you very much, everyone.